Hey guys, for Pecha Kucha today, we have in our group me, Ivan.
Ronnie.
Marshall.
Marcus.
And today we are going to be presenting the topic on Japanese internment camps. So sit back, relax, and enjoy.
Japanese were forced into internment camps not only because of wartime tensions, but also from previous prejudice against Asians in Canada. The main reason for turmoils between whites and Asians was from the notion that Asians, Japanese specifically, were going to steal all the white jobs. The white people formed the Asiatic Exclusion League and in 1907, and later in that year, they rioted through the Asian dominance areas in Vancouver, trashing businesses and housing in Chinatown and Japantown. During World War I, as white men would go out to war, youthful Asians would steal the jobs such as fishing, more specifically pulling in nets from boats to reel in the fish, which you didn't need a work permit for. After the war, some Canadians thought it was wrong to continue to relocate Japanese back to Japan. They rallied to appeal the bill which made it necessary for Japanese to be deported. This movement was brought all the way to the Supreme Court, where the vote was to keep the deportations. A couple of years later, the bill was repealed due to continuous protest. One of the main reasons the Japanese feel bitterly about their internment is because it was completely unjust and unnecessary. The Japanese posed no real threat to Canada during World War II, since Japan wouldn't dare attack the west coast with the US Navy there. Most families who were split up during internment never found each other again, and entire generations split from their families. In 1988, Prime Minister Brian Mulroney issued a formal apology to all those affected by the camps.
To decide what is important to learn about the past, we must analyze the attitudes and perspectives of the several sides of such an event and understand why it is significantly different than what can be considered the status quo of life in that period of time. The Japanese's internment was considered significant as it had done wrong so many of Canada's own citizens, even when military advisors and the RCMP did not consider the Japanese families living on the west coast to be a threat at all. Even after the end of the war, instead of being compensated, almost 4,000 Japanese ended up being deported to Japan and many others were forced to move east. This was finally the tipping point in where the highly prevalent racism in Canada had to be addressed. However, real change did not come until 43 years later, on September 22nd, 1988, when Canada finally apologized.
The Japanese, as well as the Ukrainians, worked long hours while being paid insufficient amounts. The Japanese worked on farms, and the Ukrainians mainly did construction work, especially road building. However, these internment camps eventually came to an end. The first internment camps were brought up after the destruction of Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, and they were gone in 1949. This was also the year that Japanese Canadians were able to live in Canada. At this time, the Canadian government were allowed to deport Japanese Canadians. There was no immigration during this period because no one tried to go into Canada while they had the internment camps. The population of the Japanese lowered at this time, but after 1949, the immigration continued the same way as it did before the internment camps took place. The relationship between the Canadian government and the Japanese population in Canada was fairly decent for the most part, other than while the Japanese were in the internment camps. The Canadian government saw the Japanese as threats to the military and did not want to take any chances in case they happened to be a real danger. The Japanese thought the Canadian government was ruthless, which is understandable because Canada kept their internment camps running longer than necessary. The United States had removed their internment camps when the World War had ended, but Canada decided to keep theirs up for another 4 years. This is strange because the United States were attacked, but the Japanese never targeted Canada.
Perhaps the most prevalent source of evidence comes from the creation and records of the British Columbia Security Commission. Established in 1941 to oversee the internment of the Japanese Canadians living on the West Coast, its creation marked the infamous event of Japanese internment camps within Canada. The Japanese's home away from their beloved homes for the next 4 years.
This is a primary source evidence towards the internment of Japanese Canadians in British Columbia. Created in 1941 by Austin C. Taylor, who was the chairman of the British Columbia Security Commission. It was created as a notice to the Japanese Canadians with the intent of keeping them out of certain areas in BC. This marks the beginning of the Japanese Canadian internment in British Columbia.
Before the war had started, the Japanese were already seen as inferior and were racially abused on a daily basis by white people. The attack on Pearl Harbor provided a perfect excuse to rid the Japanese Canadians of their businesses and homes and force them out of white communities and into separate towns and camps. This let the government tax them for dirty food, clothing, and shelter and to liquidate the property of the Japanese Canadians a year later inside the camps. The implications left for today from the internment camps include a better understanding of Canada's rough history of racism and how we, as more modern
modernized society has changed for the better. Perhaps the heaviest implications include the need for reparations and restitution in the multicultural bond that we as Canada share.
To better understand the choices made by the Canadian government and the Japanese people, first we have to put ourselves in their shoes and understand the different relevant circumstances that affected their choices. Now, after the attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7th, 1941, the Canadian government forced the relocation of all Canadians of Japanese heritage to internment camps all across Canada.
In a time of war, many things are neglected: human rights, freedom, and racial tolerance. Combined with the different opinions on racial discrimination, out of fear of security of its own citizens, the Canadian government interned the Japanese Canadians. At that time, the Japanese military had just launched an attack on Pearl Harbor, and another attack on the military while still unprepared is still a possibility. With an increasing transparency of actions within a government body, violations of human rights are broadcasted to the public thanks to modern media and technology. This usually results in public protests and/or the termination of a government official. This is supported by the ongoing journalistic freedom today.
By delving into the perspectives of both the government and the Japanese people, we can see that although the government had somewhat of a viable reason, it was not so overwhelming that they would have to intern every single Japanese living on the West Coast. However, they did have a reason for it, and even though we may not completely understand it, we must remember that this mindset and set of morals we possess today differs from that of the past almost tenfold. My group mates:
Marcus.
Marshall.
Ronnie.
And I would just like to sincerely thank everyone for listening to our Pecha Kucha on Japanese internment camps. It took a while to make, so we hope everybody enjoyed it.